Hey guys, Heather here with a quick heads up on the next 2 episodes. We had the privilege of sitting down with 2 licensed professional counselors who are also believers and experienced in ministry fundraising. This was a rich discussion, and given all the ground we covered, we've decided to bring this to you in 2 episodes. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did.
So, Mrs. Winchell, you've heard my vision and some of the need. How would you and your husband feel about coming onto our partnership team for $100 a month?
This scene might seem familiar to some of you. The question is, what are you feeling in that moment? The fundraising season ushers in a certain level of disruption and increased stress. Our responses in this season can differ depending on a variety of things, including prior experience and the way we view ourselves or others. Without the tools to navigate the unexpected dynamics of fundraising, a person can experience unnecessary strain and even momentum paralysis. Let's explore the different ways that our lack of awareness or healing can impact our readiness for fundraising and ministry. Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Today, we are super excited to have with us 2 licensed professional counselors. We have Lee Lester and Elina Zentz, and I've just asked them to introduce themselves for us. Tell us a little bit about your background, maybe any exposure to overseas living, ministry, fundraising, and just where you're coming from philosophically, educationally, etc. Let's start with Lee.
Thanks, Andy. I have about 6 years of experience overseas, a few years in Asia, and then a couple in the Middle East. And I just completed my master's degree and have just began practicing as a licensed professional counselor.
Fantastic.
My name is Elina Zentz. I have been a licensed professional counselor for a while now. I graduated 10 years ago and have been involved either in agency work or private practice ever since. And I mostly focus on trauma and anything that goes under the trauma umbrella. And my overseas experience has been fairly lengthy. I started in 2004, and I have had the privilege of living in different countries and also going on short-term mission trips. And quite honestly, I am still living overseas as I originally come from Latvia, which is a small Eastern European country. And I have been here permanently since 2009 when I got married to my husband.
And here is the United States.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And where are you from originally? Where's home in America?
I'm from Hope, Arkansas.
Hope, Arkansas. Fantastic.
Nice.
Dirty South.
All right. So both of you are clinical counselors, but you're both also Christians. How does your faith impact how you do your jobs? What do you say to someone who's concerned with a clinical approach to self-care? They might say, that's secular. I need something biblical.
That's good.
That is also a lot of questions in one question.
Okay, let's back it up. Start with, how does your faith impact how you do your jobs?
For me, it definitely has been a journey. When I started out, it was almost seemed like black and white. It was very simple. This is biblical. This is more secular. But as I have grown more into who I am as a counselor and also have learned a lot more about the field, about how we work as human beings, and how even physiologically how our bodies work and what happens to us when we go through trauma or anything that's really overwhelming, I can truly say that I believe you can't separate that anymore. Biblical and counseling is so connected because counseling truly reveals the glory of God and how we have been created. And there's so much still to uncover, and none of it if it's sound counseling really truly goes against what's biblical.
I like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, just because something might be labeled secular, it doesn't really mean that the fundamentals of a biblical framework are not deeply embedded in that. And I guess, some of the basic skills of counseling, if you look at the Code of Ethics, is listening, empathizing, and encouraging autonomy. So I think, anybody who is looking for a professional therapist, counselor, they need to be looking for those things, people. Because when I wanted to be a counselor, I was like, oh yeah, I'll just tell everybody what to do, give them great advice. And that's really, there's a little bit of that, but that's like a 5% maybe of really what counseling embodies. It's a lot of...
Yeah, what's the 90%?
Ooh, yeah, the 90%. Like I said before, listening, empathizing, reflecting back to the client, and even kind of helping the client too when they have some contradictions between values and maybe choices they're making. Just really bringing those to the table and letting the client see those, and then really allowing the client to make these choices, because we've all been given advice. And we've all tried to give other people advice, and they're really not going to follow things unless they want to or they agree with it. And so those are some of the fundamentals of I would say, general academic secular counseling.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was at a class this past Sunday at my church, and it was about Christianity and mental health. One of the observations the speaker made was that people of in the older generation, my age and up, had a very strong suspicion of kind of secular clinical counseling. And they're like, no, you do not need any of that stuff. All you need is scripture. And then people that are younger, like Gen Z, are like, I need a professional, and that's my main entry point for advice and counsel. And the Bible's kind of out here. It doesn't really help me with that stuff, really. So what do you say to somebody who says, this is secular? I need the Bible only?
I would start out that there are a lot of topics that the Bible doesn't cover because it's not the purpose.
Sure.
The purpose is to reveal God. And even with the scripture, as Lee was talking, I was thinking about in Romans when Paul talks about that nobody has an excuse because even the nature reveals God. In the same way, science can do that as well. Quite honestly, now, even secular counseling will say faith and spirituality is important. It is quite honestly one of the most crucial parts in somebody's healing journey and recovery. And secular counseling is not throwing out somebody's faith. What happens on the ground in counseling room, a lot of things people bring in their own biases, reactions, and that's a different story. But in general, sound counseling will make space for spirituality. And if in somebody's case that's Christianity and their faith in Jesus, then the person can bring that in. And a good, respectful counselor will provide space for that.
Yeah, and I would say, I think to give the other generation some credit is, Freud and Albert Ellis and Jung and some of those people, they were pretty open about their beliefs in secular atheism or whatever it is. And so, like Elina said, recently there's really been a big shift in the academic world to accept that spirituality is really important in your mental health. And so that's, I think, we've kind of come back to that.
So it's not your grandfather's counseling.
Right. And also I would say, Freud or whoever it is, we shouldn't be listening to them about their spiritual topics and let that affect their opinion of the psychological, which is their focus and and I believe, through the common grace of God, that He's given them they're made in the image of God, and we're able to have those talents to understand the mind in a way that somebody else would not, that has maybe engineering or mathematics or whatever it might be. Or even, I would even say like pretty close to it, but similar like philosophy, which C.S. Lewis obviously is gifted in that. But he will tell you like he's not going to give you advice on your like psychological problems.
What about somebody who says, well, can't you just go to your pastor for all these things?
Yeah, that's a valid question. I mean, really pastors, there's I'm thinking of a lot of jokes out there about like pastors, how they're really equipped for everything from like business decisions, marriage, money, like all these different things. But I would say to some degree, and I'm generalizing here, but I would say that their focus is and should be the Bible, and it shouldn't be mental health.
Sure.
I would say that would maybe even be a problem of why so many pastors are burning out is because there's just the flock has kind of given them this assumption that they should be the professional in everything.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I would just like to add on to that, a lot of pastors are not equipped to handle quite a bit of mental health issues. A pastor most likely will not be able to tell when a person is going into a shutdown or when they are triggered because they have to talk about, or if a person is forced to talk about too many details of what has happened to them, and the pastor might perceive it like, oh, this is a great thing, like we're working through this. It might be the absolute least thing that a person needs to be doing in that moment. And a trained professional can recognize that and have the tools how to keep the person safe.
Yeah, and I guess like overall, like just giving some people like I guess my perspective of, I am asking the Holy Spirit and asking God to give me wisdom before I go into a session with a client, asking God to provide the wisdom, the insight, the clarity, the healing. But really, from my experience, the practical ways of therapeutic healing and growth typically relate to the client's past, to their family, their home life, and really how that's kind of shaped like their maladaptive thinking and ineffective ways of handling stress and anxiety, and even, possibly inaccurate views of themselves that are not biblical. Unbiblical like ways of relating to other people, food, money, anything like that. So to summarize again, like the fundamentals of a biblical framework are there, but we just go at it from a different perspective with those kind of assumed.
Yeah.
Why do we think we need to spiritualize therapy?
I would say there's a fear there. If grandma, she knows Psalms and she knows all the Bible, like she wants to go to somebody and she feels comfortable there, but really like facing a lot of these scarier demons of traumas from your childhood, how you were loved or not loved by your parents. Those are things that touch a little closer to home. Pardon the pun.
Yeah, and I'm not a licensed professional counselor, so I might be way off. You guys can correct me, but it just seems to me that maybe even culturally, people are far more comfortable sitting in a more cerebral space. And the beautiful thing about the Bible is that it is full of truth, and it is full of truth that our life is to be steeped in, right? There are invitations all over Scripture to trust the Lord, to depend on the Lord, to look to Him for our healing and things like that. And so I think part of the tension that we're feeling, or that the pain point, is it is maybe more comfortable to just kind of comply or apply a piece of Scripture rather than wrestling through whatever the deeper wound is and letting Jesus meet you there, right? It's just easier to kind of bypass that altogether and believe something to be true about God without it kind of forcing a deeper conversation or like a deeper wound being exposed.
Yeah, and I would think part of that too is just intellectualizing our faith. And really, I think the feelings and emotions part is part of the thing that they're avoiding by wanting to just look and read and study.
Yeah, because that feels very controllable.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
One of the scariest things for people is to feel truly what they're feeling, the impact of what they've been through, because they believe if I start feeling this, the pain will never go away. And it is so intense and overwhelming. And so it's a lot easier to shove it down and just stay in your head.
Sure.
All right. Well, I am excited. All of that from our first
question.
Yeah. Okay. So as we dive right in, I would love to just start by giving the listener a general overview of how our brain responds to threat or obstacle. So like what biologically happens when we are uncomfortable or feel vulnerable?
So I guess I can jump right into it.
Make it simple for us.
I will make it simple.
Thank you.
We all have a brain.
Yeah, good.
And we all have this thing called nervous system. And all the systems in our body communicate to each other. And so the nervous system has two main branches, and then which is sympathetic and parasympathetic branch. And the parasympathetic branch will go into two different branches, which is a ventral vagus nerve and a dorsal vagus nerve. And each of these branches is responsible for different things in order to help us function, to move through life, to get things done, to keep us safe. Then there's also the brain, and the brain also has multiple parts. And there is the neocortex, where all our reasoning is based and logical thinking, and we can be all cool about that. And then there's limbic system, where there are multiple brain parts in there, but that is responsible for relationships and emotion regulation. And then there's this, it's more like a brainstem, but it's also called the reptilian brain. And a lot of people don't like that.
The lizard brain.
The lizard brain. Okay.
And I'm not really sure how I personally feel towards that word, but that's a different story. And the lizard brain or reptilian brain is responsible, it holds all our survival instincts. And so what happens when there's a threat or a perceived threat, like let's say there's a car coming at you, like Lee's standing in a corner and a car is just coming full speed. For him, in order to survive, the brain is not going to allow for the neocortex to stay online. His limbic system and his reptilian lizard brain will engage so that he can jump out of the way. Because the neocortex would be going, there's a car coming. I wonder how fast it's coming. What should I do about this now?
Don't they see me?
So basically, he makes an unconscious decision to move, or his body unconsciously.
Right. And it happens within seconds, and the body is going to move. So what happens in the nervous system in that moment when there is such active threat coming at a person, sympathetic branch is going to get activated. And so that will allow to get out of danger. But it also gets activated to help people to go to work, to get things done. It happens throughout the day multiple times. And then it goes back into resting state or in the ventral state.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can imagine a slinky going back and forth, that's what a regulated nervous system will look like. There is arousal, and then there is resting and coming down.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of always fluxing through this.
We're always fluxing.
Okay.
It's never just a straight line. I think that's when you're dead. Or at least in a complete freeze state. And it also doesn't shoot up super high or super low. And then when a person has experienced hard experiences or something growing up where there are some maybe messages they have received, sometimes there's trauma, sometimes they are overwhelming experiences, the nervous system can learn to respond and continue to respond when there's no threat anymore. But the brain keeps perceiving a threat.
And that would that be what people refer to as like triggering?
That would be triggering.
Okay.
Yeah. And so either a person can be activated, and which is the flight-fight response, or depending on what they have experienced in life, they can go into a freeze state, which is the dorsal branch, so that they can go so still that they can't be seen. There are physiological processes that happen in our bodies when a nervous system gets activated. Heart rate increases, blood flow increases, actually your body will start to bring your blood flow away from or blood vessels that are close to the skin, just in case you get injured.
Get into a knife fight.
That probably will go deeper than just the surface. But sure.
Yeah.
And then the dorsal state, there will be less breathing, there will be less oxygen to the brain so that a person can go completely still. And that's literally is a freeze without the temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So could you say some people get big and some people get small? Is that too simplified?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or it's like maybe like a shutdown.
Shutdown is another word for that. Okay. So the dorsal response is just that's the part of the nervous branch that gets activated in that moment. But it will look like a shutdown.
I just want to draw awareness to the fact that everybody listening has a brain and a body. So we're not just talking about knowledge. We're talking about like something actually happening in your body. Your nervous system in your body that you're not aware of does these things, which is just helpful to remember. It's not just knowledge. It's not just big words we don't know.
And it's also not something that just happens. People can learn to develop awareness around it. Somatic therapists call it felt awareness. But, well, I have had the privilege of working with this for 8 years now and working on myself. I can tell at any given moment which branch is more activated and where I'm at, just because I have done the work and learned to pay attention to my sensations. And I know which sensations are responsible for what.
So if somebody asks you to go and fundraise, how does that
What does that
you?
activate?
What does that activate?
That will be my sympathetic branch through the roof.
Okay.
And most likely, where's the next exit door?
Okay.
It will not be ventral, where it would be relaxed, at ease. I'm ready to connect with people.
Which actually just, points to the fact that, as we suspect, most people do not enter the fundraising season totally relaxed, kind of ambivalent, super chill, which is why we want to have this conversation. But I'm curious, Lee, do you have anything to add?
I guess just from talking about it right now, like in my own mind, I'm like, oh yeah, if I just view it from like a relational aspect, then it will be much more enjoyable for me. And so, when I raised support too, there was a little bit of that, but there was definitely a lot of stress from the other areas.
Sure.
And I just want to add another thing. This is my last thing on the nervous system, maybe. The sympathetic activation happens naturally, and so is the shutdown. To return to the relaxed state, ventral state, that's something we as human beings can and need to work on and cultivate. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's super hard work. Like as Lee was saying, if I approach this from a relationship perspective and I go and talk to a person and I see the person, I already have maybe a relationship and they are not going to be out there to get me. So relatively a safe person. Then my nervous system will co-regulate with his nervous system and do the work of creating more access to the ventral state, just naturally.
And the ventral state, again, is the relaxed state?
The relaxed state where we are able to have relationships, we're able to co-regulate with other people, because after all, we are social beings.
And maybe a lot of the anxiety comes from just the assumption, some of these narratives or whatever in our lives, that if I'm going to ask you for money, that I'm really going to be stressing you out. I'm really going to be putting a burden on you, and this is really going to be stressful for all of us. So if we can just shift that narrative a little bit to like what you said, like we're just going to hang out and we're going to work on our relationship, and I have this cool story I want to tell you, that kind of takes a lot of the pressure off of it maybe.
Yeah, but I think that brings up a really good point, Andy, because acknowledging that you're going into something thinking, oh, this is going to burden them. There's a reason that that's your posture, right? There's a reason you're going into that thinking they'll respond in a certain way or fearing even a certain response.
Yeah.
So I think we understand that people come to the fundraising season with a lot of preconceived obstacles or expectations. And in the Provisio curriculum, we start at that place identifying what those obstacles and those beliefs are, because we understand that those thoughts and obstacles are birthed in a certain context. There's a reason people are showing up thinking of those 3 words for fundraising, or kind of assuming that it will look like this or that. And so, understanding that we are all shaped consciously and unconsciously by our experiences, I'd love to hear you guys speak to how, I guess I've heard the term the family as a classroom. How do our prior experiences affect how we show up to fundraising?
So I guess specifically with money.
Sure. Yeah.
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 That's where we can start.
Yeah.
And the thing that jumps to my mind is this book I read by, I'm about to say a bad word, Dave Ramsey. His daughter, Rachel Cruz, wrote this book, Know Yourself, Know Your Money. And it has this model that we all grew up in a classroom. And I actually think, like, clinically about everybody, this is true in a lot of, whether it's how you deal with conflict, how you deal with emotions, like those are all, we all learn those from our family and childhood, directly or indirectly, but also about money. And so Rachel does a really good job in this book of kind of selecting, it's kind of like a quadrant with 4 quadrants. And so the first one is the anxious quadrant that somebody, the classroom they grew up in. And basically what that means is it was not talked about, but it was felt. Like, when you remember, like when you asked your mom, I need cleats for next week for soccer, like the stress that you felt, it wasn't talked about. Or maybe the stress at the checkout center, at the checkout line with your mom. Or like maybe recognizing, like, your mom would always buy like maybe the day old bread. Yeah. And then you went with some friends to, this is a story in the book, like then you went with some friends to the grocery store, and the mom was like inspecting every loaf. And then you were like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, I'm looking for the freshest bread. And then you mentioned that to your mom next time. And she's like, no, we can't afford that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't do fresh bread.
We don't do fresh bread. And then just like a lot of that. So there's just a lot of anxiety around that. And so I think that the main problem how that can affect somebody is really the fear behind just money in general. And then the second of the 4 classrooms is like unstable. That's where it's like really talked about really openly, maybe argued about, maybe even your neighbor, your friends, when they're over, they hear about money. It's very open, but the problem with that is kind of, I guess, some apathy about just kind of wanting to give up, or even maybe stick your head in the sand when it comes to money, just because as a kid, like, there's just trauma around like the arguments and everything. So you just want to avoid money.
Too sensitive.
Too sensitive. Yeah. The third one is like the unaware. That's where you really didn't feel any emotions and it wasn't really talked about it at all. But at some point in your life, you recognize, wait a second, like, we're broke. Or like, maybe it's after you get married, take a peek at your parents' finances, and then you recognize that, oh no, things have never been good. And I always thought they were. I just never even thought about it, possibly. Sure. So that's the third kind. And
would that kind of fit with like betrayal? Like you kind of felt like reality was one way, but then you kind of harshly realized it's not? Like,
totally.
Would that be? Okay.
Totally. And maybe as people, start to gain insight into your own past, like, there can be a lot of feelings. And that's a great point to bring up, Heather, just the idea of, we want to be gracious to our parents and like just assume that like they did the best they could. And
Amen.
Yeah, they did the best they could, and really even thinking about their childhood as well and how that formed them, the stories of their parents. And there's probably stories in your families that have to do with money, and those will tell you a lot about your kind of history of money. But that third one was just kind of being unaware, and really with that, it's really easy to kind of ignore responsibility. And so, it could look a lot of different ways. Like, maybe you start, finally you're making $50,000 a year, and then you just start like giving lots of money away to all these people because you're like, oh my gosh, it's great. But then you don't realize how negatively that's affected you and is affecting your future decisions as well, and your family. So So those are the three that are kind of negative, and the last one is just kind of a secure classroom to grow up in. That's really where there's like the emotion is calm, but the communication is open. And so, I think that's. I think that really this affects people in their fundraising, really in a lot of ways. But the main way is just you're talking about money, and you have to be very open about, like, I'm asking for this amount. This is for spending money, and then this is going to be for my retirement. I mean, I even had somebody at one point kind of indirectly told me, you don't need retirement because you're putting money into Social Security. And I wanted to immediately ask them, like, are you doing that? 'Cause I'm pretty sure you're not.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
It just made me think of another aspect, and I don't know if this would come up or not, but Americans are so scared to talk about money openly.
Right. Culturally,
It's such a big, big taboo, and there's so much shame attached. And from what I have experienced, it doesn't matter whether you have a lot or not much, but it's always the same reaction.
Yeah, and I don't know how or where this would fit into the kind of different quadrants that she put forward, but just understanding that where you grow up, like in the kind of the culture around how normative debt is, how normative like affluence is, it's just there's a lot we can internalize about, like if you're in a situation where really it's no thing to give to everything people ask you to give to. And in other situations, it doesn't look like that. There's definitely more discernment that has to go into where to steward those funds and things like that. And even in a culture, the way that's happening. And I guess the reason I'm thinking of this is I recently watched the movie Belfast. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's about a family unit in Ireland. And it was just very normative within the playing out of that movie that every family was unable to pay their rent. It was just normative in that setting that like, well, yeah, everybody's behind on rent. And because that was normative, maybe there wasn't as much shame around it as in maybe growing up in a small town. And if it's a pretty affluent town, but then there's this one family that has a hard time paying their rent, it feels very different to see those around you being so different. So I think that's another element that can inform the way we show up to talk about money. It's like what the culture around us, like at the classroom too.
It almost talks about what is the generational message that's being passed down, and what are the stories that we carry generationally. And they become deeply embedded in us. And so those are automatic responses. And it's absolutely essential, I have to say, to go back and be curious enough. What are the stories that we carry? What are the narratives that we hold that just come out of us so fast because they've been there for a long time and we are so used to them? But what's the impact of all of that? And how did these stories and these experiences shaped us?
And is that hard to process by yourself?
No, you can do that by yourself. Okay. You don't necessarily need to go to a therapist to do that. All it really takes is the first step. Are you curious enough to understand, how come I'm reacting this way? I wonder why it's so hard for me to talk about this.
You have to be pretty self-aware, though.
Yeah.
That reminds me of this book, last name Allender. He talks about
Dan Allender.
Dan Allender, about your own story. I can't remember the book, but it's like just thinking about these different themes. Like you can like think about your family and money, and then what are some common like stories told in your family? So and so, like, had to live on this during the Great Depression, or Uncle so and so did this and had to sell the farm. So and so got a divorce, and we had to. So all these different like themes for this under this topic of money that you remember that are talked about like at Christmas, funerals, weddings. All those different things are really kind of insight into, I would say, the larger current that you were in that you really weren't aware of.
Yeah, I remember very clearly many times hearing the story of my grandparents growing up being newlyweds during the Depression, and like they would just pinch their pennies, and maybe one week they would splurge and buy the salt shaker, and the next week they would say, or the next month or whatever it is, like they would buy the pepper shaker. So yeah, that was a recurring theme in my childhood.
So in this book by Peter Scazzaro called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he talks about like 10 commandments in the family, and there could be like the 10 commandment is like live, laugh, love, right? So that means like thou shalt not frown. But there's
that's the implied.
Right. That's the implied kind of commandment for the home.
Yeah.
But also there's financial ones that, I just think of my family and some common ones maybe is like, somebody is, if they're rich, they are important. They are wise, to some degree. They are good. Or another one could be like money is the best source of security. Maybe another one is like making money is the only way to prove you made it or you're successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are just some examples of possible, like, I guess, rules of your family.
And usually with rules that somebody grows up with, people tend to live them out to the best of our ability, either consciously or subconsciously, or just because they think that's the only way. And there will be a physical response to those. We can separate what we believe from what's happening in our bodies. And so oftentimes people will experience fear, which oftentimes can translate into anxiety. They can go into a shutdown and freeze response, and that can manifest in different behaviors, even maybe like inability to budget or overspend. Oftentimes, and I would say in most cases, the nervous system is involved in how we deal with these things or what we experience.
Yeah. And I could even see how that applies directly to, to meeting with somebody, with a potential supporter. Like you might not call them, you might not follow up if you grew up in a certain classroom because you're afraid, you just don't want to talk about money. And some other examples could be, you might just, instead of asking them like, I hope that you can give 100 a month, you might just say 50 just because of the family you grew up in and money.
Yeah.
And all of this will be just automatic response unless there's awareness and noticing this is what drives me. This is why I have this reaction.
All right, guys, this is where we are going to take a pause and finish up our conversation in the next episode. Thanks for joining us today. See you there.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.